Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending this virtual press briefing. I think we'll start now. And as you know, this briefing is on the impact of COVID-19 on a range of social and economic sectors and how they are responding worldwide. My name's Rosalind Yard and I'm Chief of News and Media at the ILO. Now, you should have received the links to the briefs as well as to the press release which we sent out about an hour ago, which summarises the findings. And so for this afternoon, we'll begin with a short overview from the Director of the ILO's Sectoral Policies Department, Alette Van Leur, and the Sectoral Policies Deputy Director, Akira Isawa. We'll then open the floor to the panel of experts who will take your questions. And just to remind you, our panel are Maria Angeles Fortuny, who is Head of the Forestry, Agriculture, Construction and Tourism Unit at the ILO, Brant Wagner, Head of the Transport and Maritime Sectors Unit, Casper Edmonds, Head of the Extractives, Energy and Manufacturing Unit, Oliver Liang, Head of the Private and Public Services Sectors Unit, and Christiane Wiskow, Senior Health Services Specialist. And you'll find their names and titles in the media advisory we sent you yesterday. Please make sure that your media outlet is added to your names in the participants list. All journalists' mic will be muted and controlled by our technician. Raise the hand icon to indicate that you have a question and we will go down the list. Unmute your mic and give you we'll unmute your mic and give you the floor. We'll then take one question at a time. If you have a follow-on question, please include it with your original question. And just a reminder that there'll be no embargo. So I'll now give the floor to Alette Van Leur, Director of the Sectoral Policies Department. Thank you, Alette, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Rosalind, and good afternoon. Good afternoon, journalists and colleagues also. Thank you so much for joining this press briefing. The world of work is facing the worst global crisis since the Second World War. The ILO is joining forces with its 187 member states, workers and employees organizations around the world in monitoring the impact of the pandemic and also proposing, and that's more important of course, proposing responses and solutions. Solutions to protect public health and to mitigate the damage in key social and economic sectors. The series of 10 sectoral briefs that are now before you are the ILO's preliminary assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on specific social and economic sectors and industries. The impact of COVID-19 differs from sector to sector. The new heroes, as we keep calling them, because they truly are, the new heroes of our time are the workers in health and in public emergency services, in transport and public utilities, sanitation, education and food supply. They provide essential services while being exposed to high risk of infection. It is ironic that these workers, whom we rely on so much now, do not always enjoy decent terms and conditions of work. We must invest in safe and decent working conditions for these important service workers, now and in the future. And moreover, this crisis has already demonstrated that we must ensure that our health systems are resilient and always crisis prepared. Across sectors, a majority of workers are not adequately covered by social protection systems. The self-employed, casual and gig workers are disproportionately hit by the impact of the virus. This includes also informal sector workers, as they generally do not have access to paid or sick leave, health insurance, and other forms of conventional social security systems. Women are overrepresented in the most affected sectors and occupations. Migrant workers are particularly vulnerable. They often are out of work, but unable to travel home. And then the seafarers. The ILO has always played a special role in supporting seafarers already from its inception in 1919, seafarers have had a special place within the ILO. Thousands of them now around the world are unable to access their ships and others are unable to return home. The economic impact of the pandemic is likely to be severe and sustained. This pandemic has quickly turned into a major economic and labor market crisis, affecting not only supply, production of goods and services, but also demand, consumption and investment in all sectors. Civil aviation, tourism, retail, culture, transport, shipping, those are among the service sectors that have been hit the hardest. My colleagues will respond to questions. They are the specialists in these sectors, and we are happy to provide some really harsh data, but also some info on possible responses to mitigate the crisis. Meanwhile, the automotive and the textiles and clothing industry, electronics and other manufacturing industries, as well as agriculture, are struggling. As workers are told to stay at home, factories are closed, borders are closed, and global supply chains grind to a halt. Micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises are a vital source of employment and growth in all of these sectors. And they are likely to be impacted hardest by the effect of the global crisis. Just to give you a couple of examples from these sectors. The travel and tourism industry, which by many is called the hardest hit sector in this pandemic. Prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, it was expected to reach 11.5% global gross domestic product. It has been particularly hard hit. On the employment in the shipping sector, with its 2 million seafarers and other examples, is substantial. The cruise ship sector, we have all heard the examples of the cruise ships in the news, of course, with the stranded seafarers, also passengers, but particularly also the seafarers, who seem to get less attention than the passengers sometimes. So 250,000 seafarers. In certain countries, they have been advised against travel by on the cruise ship, and major cruise companies have suspended operations. The automotive industry is struggling. An abrupt and widespread stoppage of economic activity, we have seen. Workers are told to stay at home, and in 2017, global direct employment in the industry was still nearly 40 million workers. This is only direct employment. And my colleague, Mr. Edmonds, will speak to the indirect employment in that particular very important industry, often referred to as the industry of industries. And then due to the severe travel restrictions and the expected global recession, the IATA estimates that the industry passenger revenues could plummet by $250 billion in 2020 alone. Then there's the textiles, clothing, and leather and footwear industries. Demand has been severely suppressed, and cancellations of orders are now being discussed. There's also calls for supply chain solidarity, and we have even heard that call from one of the important employer associations in the textiles and leather industry. Now, agriculture and food security also badly affected. The recent temporary suspension of one of the world's largest tea auctions in Mombasa, Kenya, where tea from many Eastern African countries is traded, could have a devastating effect on local, national, and regional economies. Plantation sector workers are being sent home. They have no income, and also they are crucial in providing food security themselves. They produce the food, but they are not allowed to work at the moment. The responses to these problems must be urgent, well coordinated, and on a global scale. Immediate relief is needed for workers and enterprises to protect business and livelihoods, particularly in these hard-hit sectors, and I would like to emphasize, particularly in developing countries. So as some countries reopen for business, and this is a clear warning, as some countries reopen for business, we must ensure safe work practices to prevent further waves of the pandemic. This is a message that the ILO would like to re-emphasize. There's a lot of discussions at the moment about reopening business, but this must only be done if it's safe for workers. Safe work practices, I cannot emphasize that enough. The Director General of the International Labour Organization, Mr. Guy Ryder, calls for an immediate human-centered response through solidarity to the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments and sectoral employers and workers have come together in this time of crisis to find solutions and guidance together, as reflected in a growing number of joint statements, recommendations, joint letters. You can find all of them on the ILO website. And by working together, they help save lives, keep enterprises afloat, and protect jobs and livelihoods, which is, of course, of the essence. The ILO stands ready to continue to work with its member states and sectoral constituents to find solutions for how we can build back better after the pandemic. Building back better is our ambition. And we would like to invest in a more resilient, inclusive, but also more sustainable sectors and societies in the post-pandemic future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alette. I'll just now give the floor to Akira Isawa, who is the Deputy Director of the Sectoral Policies Department. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. If I may add very briefly, I would like to emphasize sectoral social dialogue. In order to tackle and mitigate the impact of COVID-19 and to find solutions in each sector, the role of social dialogue is very important. This means we should involve employers and workers' organizations at sectoral level and encourage them to participate in formulating and implementing support measures for sectors most affected by the pandemic. Sectoral social dialogue should be promoted at global, national, and enterprise level. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Akira. So I'll now open the floor to your questions. So if you could raise your hand using the blue icon, and then when I call on you, if you could just, because some of you haven't, it's not clear which outlets you're representing, but if you could also say who you're representing. So please, if you can send us your, let us know who would like to ask the next questions. I don't see any hands raised. Could we, okay, I see Laurent Sierro, who has a question for us. Laurent, could you go ahead, please? Your mic should be unmuted soon. Laurent, can you hear? Your mic is unmuted. Could you ask your question? Okay, maybe there's a technical issue. Maybe we could take another question while we sort out the issue with Laurent's question. Does some... This one. Okay, can I check that you can hear me? Does anybody else have a question? Okay, I don't know whether we have some technical issues here that you can't hear me, but perhaps we can, I can ask my colleague, Brant Wagner, to just maybe give an overview of the issues in the shipping industry.
Yeah, thank you, Rosalind. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, in the shipping industry, the crisis obviously is hitting the industry hard for a number of reasons. One reason, of course, is the loss of trade. Trade is reduced substantially. We've seen figures 13%, maybe going up to 32%, something like that. Loss in trade in the next over the next year. And so obviously if less ships are moving, then less cargo is transported, and seafarers are not going to have as many jobs. The oil industry is a little bit different because a lot of oil tankers are being used to store oil because of the low price of oil. But in shipping, this crisis hits in several ways. One way is, of course, in the health of seafarers, just like everybody else, their health and their protection against the virus. But it also hits in other ways, operational ways. So a big problem that occurred very early in the pandemic was the ability of seafarers to join and leave their ships. About 100,000 seafarers do this every month. They join the ship, they go home. So these restrictions on joining and leaving ships, and also restrictions on travel, have substantially affected these seafarers, many of whom have been working for quite a long time on ships, so they're subject to fatigue. So these are some of the main issues that have hit. Also things like access to medical care ashore. And of course, you probably read a lot about the cruise line sector, which is sort of a subsector of shipping, where one of the big issues is, of course, the cruise ships not being able to even enter into ports and disembark passengers. So it's had a big effect.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I see that we do have a couple of questions coming. The first one, Antonio Brotto from FA. Antonio, could you go ahead with your question, please?
Yes, hello. So I have a question on the, I don't know how to say in English, the universal basic income. I think it's because in Spain there is a debate on whether this kind of income should be operating after this crisis with so many people losing their jobs. So what is the position of ILO on this basic income?
Shall I go ahead, Rosalind?
Yes, go ahead, Alette.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, the ILO doesn't have a position on the basic income as such. The ILO does have a very strong position on a basic social protection floor. It's slightly different, of course. It's a much more comprehensive system, I would say. But if the world would have had, as we have called for, basic social protection floors, covering income protection, health insurance, and health coverage for everyone, of course, I think the world would have been in a better place than what we have seen now. This is an ambition, and this is an ambition that the ILO will continue to strive for. Thank you.
Thank you, Alette. And in fact, we can go back to Laurent, who's he had a problem with his mic, so he's sent a written question, which is, do we have figures sector by sector of what could be the impact in terms of losses of jobs?
Again, if I may, yes, we do. We have rough estimates, but this crisis is unfolding as we speak. The pandemic and its impact on the world of work is severe. And as I mentioned earlier, and sustained also. We do have figures, preliminary figures, and perhaps I may call on one of my colleagues to provide some details. Casper, would you be ready to respond to some of the questions in the sectors that you're covering? And then perhaps Marie-Angels, could you also mention some impact on, for example, particularly tourism? Over to you.
Thank you, Alette. Thank you for the question. Yes, in the ILO's second COVID-19 and the World of Work Monitor, I believe we can send you the link later, we did some initial estimates of which sectors could be particularly hard hit by the economic impact of the crisis. where we listed also the number of jobs in each of these sectors. So I will kindly refer you to that monitor for specific data. In the industries, two of the industries that we cover in the 10 briefs, the automotive and the textiles, clothing, leather, footwear, we're looking at a particularly difficult situation. The automotive industry is hit by what we call a triple whammy. First, factories close. Second, there's been supply chain disruption. And third, there's been a complete collapse in demand. So to give a specific example of a region that's been very hard hit, that of the European Union. In the EU, there's some 2.6 million that work directly in automotive production. If you count everyone in the industry, the services that are being provided, the inputs through the supply chains, there's around 14 million workers. Now, of those 2.6 million direct workers in the industry, some 1.1 million are not working at the moment. And we don't know when they will be able to return to their jobs. And this comes at a time when the automotive industry was going through a major transition. Comes at a time when most of the automakers around the world were doing everything they could to free up cash to invest in electric vehicles and green transport solutions. So this crisis will have lasting effects, not only on jobs, but also on the ability to build back better, to have more sustainable transport solutions in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Casper. So I think one of our other experts is also going to follow up on this one.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Casper has just explained, indeed, the second ILO monitor of the COVID crisis includes in page 4 a division of all the economic sectors, which is basically assessed in terms of the current impact on economic output. The different sectors are divided in terms of low impact, low medium impact, medium high, and high impact. The 4 sectors that are considered to be most highly impacted, and that's at the time that this monitor was produced, because figures are changing day by day. So the most highly impacted sectors were accommodation and food services, real estate, business and administrative activities, manufacturing, and wholesale and retail trade repair of motor vehicles and motorcycles. That's the statistical division of these sectors. In terms of accommodation and food services, this is a bit of a proxy for the impact, the enormous, tremendous impact that the tourism sector is facing. It's estimated that about 144 million workers worldwide in accommodation and food services are being affected. But these do not include those workers, for example, working in airports, that it's estimated by other organizations, for example, that 10.2 million jobs have been put on hold because of these flight cancellations. So the impact on the tourism sector is absolutely enormous, and this is going to be discussed actually on Friday in a special meeting of the G20, where the ILO will also be participating. For example, the other sector that my unit is covering on agriculture, it's being assessed here in terms of economic output as a low, medium impact. However, it's expected that this may change in the very near future as problems related to labor shortages, maybe even a food crisis, can really, really strongly impact this sector. So I will stop here.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll move on to the next question, which is from Peter Kenny. Peter, go ahead.
My name is Peter Kenny. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm interested in the question about seafarers. So I presume that might be aimed at Brian Wagner. I'm just wondering, first of all, do you have any estimate of how many seafarers are stranded around the world and where most of them are stranded, and how they can get back to their homes or to a safe place? And secondly, what can the ILO do to negotiate with any body of people on behalf of these seafarers? Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. This is one for Brandt.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. In terms of the number of seafarers stranded, we don't, I mean, I actually was reading yesterday, even off the coast of the United States, cruise ships alone, there were something like tens of thousands of seafarers that were still on board ships, but that situation continues to change. I mean, that's where a lot of them are really stranded, on the cruise ships, because the cruise ships can't get into port, or there have been restrictions. And so they've been stuck for a while. There have been some notable cases of Australia as well. As to a global figure, I don't have a global figure. Globally, we know there are 2 million seafarers, roughly. Of those, maybe 250,000 working on cruise ships. So a good percentage of those are facing problems. But the ones that are really stranded are often the ones on the cruise ships, because cruise ship operations have stopped. The major cruise ship companies, as I think you know, have suspended operations. So cruise ships are just not going anywhere at the moment, unless just to get to their home port. In terms of facilitating getting them home, first, we're lucky in a way, or I don't know if anybody's lucky in these times, but we have an international convention, the Maritime Labor Convention, which is accepted by over 90% of the world's countries and world's fleets. So it's really accepted by almost all the major flag states of shipping. That convention has in it certain requirements that do apply to the situation, that seafarers are supposed to have the right to repatriation, and they're supposed to also be able to have protection against medical situations like the virus. So one thing that we're doing at the moment is we're working with the industry. When I say industry, I mean both the ship owners and seafarers organizations internationally, to try to facilitate the travel of seafarers to and from ships, to get them off the ship, just getting on and off the ship itself, which the Maritime Labor Convention covers to some degree, and also to facilitate their travel through airports, for example, to get home. So we're pressing that point. There has been a problem in the cruise shipping sector by some major states not immediately taking their seafarers back home. There are some major states where lots of seafarers come from. They work on ships that are very international nature, flying the flag of another country. So we've been pressing the provisions of the Maritime Labor Convention to say that this convention does call for the repatriation of seafarers, and saying that, yes, we know that this is a difficult situation and we have to make certain allowances, but we try to use that instrument as much as possible to point the states to the responsibilities, to the flag states to get them off the ships, the port states to let them get ashore, and the labor providing states to receive them back. So that's what we've been doing. And again, we're working closely with industry, and not only with the industry itself. And again, this is trade unions and also employers organizations, ship owners organizations. But we're also coordinating our work with the WHO and the International Maritime Organization. So we're all working together on this to come up with a coherent and coordinated response, which is what everybody's been asking for.
Thank you, Brandt. Okay, the next question, we're back to Laurent Sierra. Laurent, hopefully your mic is working this time.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks for the answers to the first question. I have another kind of question. The biggest achievement of Labor Conference last year was that convention against violence and harassment at work. I was wondering whether you have any indication of whether that confinement and also still working situation for quite a lot of people that still have to work, but under the pressure of the pandemics. Do we have any indication on either more prevalence of violence at work, or at the contrary, less prevalence?
Thanks, Laurent. I'm not sure it's within the scope of this one, but I'm going to just ask Alette, maybe she could make a few comments.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this very important question. But we also hear the news. We read the news also that criminality of all sorts is luckily down because of the movement restrictions. We do not have data on how this is now at the moment in terms of violence at work. But may I ask my colleague, Ms. Christiane Wisco, who was actually involved in the discussions on the new convention, to perhaps say a few words. She's also our health services specialist and is very much at ease in this area of work. So if I may, I would like to turn to my colleague, Christiane Wisco, for a response. Thank you.
Cannot unmute. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the question, very important question. We have indications throughout media reports and lots of concern about raising levels of violence in the domestic sphere because of people being confined in small spaces with lots of people around. And that, of course, has also an impact on those people who have to work at home. So this violence and harassment convention that was really a landmark achievement of the Labour Conference last year refers to domestic violence as a risk having impact on the world of work. So this is absolutely a topic that needs to be addressed. But first and foremost, it's about how to provide protection to those affected, as mainly the social services are also closed. So this is really a very big concern, especially affecting women and children. Thank you.
Thank you, Christiane. And now I see that John Staracostas also has a question. John, go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Hi, John Staracostas. I'm a freelancer. I write for publications in medicine and also in retail, and also do television. I was wondering, firstly, with reference to Mr. Wagner's comments on shipping, how much has the shipping industry been impacted, one, by loss of orders, loss of traffic, and how much are the freight rates down? For instance, let's say Trans-Pacific, how much is the traffic down? And as a result, what's the price of a container going from Shanghai to LA at the moment?
Okay, first, I can answer some of that, but I don't know it all. We had in terms of freight cargo, and in this case, I'm really separating this from the tanker sector, because the tanker oil's a bit different. But we've seen there was a WTO figure the other day of a drop of 13% and perhaps a decline going down to maybe 32% or more for the year in shipping. But these figures continue to change as the situation changes, and it goes on and on. So that would be a general pressure on the market with less cargo. Of course, there'll be probably more competition eventually on freight rates. I have not seen yet a figure that indicates whether there's been an actual drop in freight rates. The last thing I read, they seemed waiting to see if that would actually happen. So we don't know. I couldn't tell you the cost, how much there's been a change in the cost of moving a container from one place to another, from China to wherever. We don't have that information, but I would imagine as the situation goes on, and if you have overcapacity, then you will lead to a drop in rates. But we haven't seen it yet. On the other hand, with tankers, because tankers are being used to store the oil, there's been some interesting activity in the tanker market where people are taking tankers and just using them as big storage facilities, waiting perhaps for the price of oil to go up later. But that's a different situation.
Right. Thanks, Brian. John, you still have your hand up. Does that mean you have an additional question?
Manufacturing component of the briefing. I'm very much interested. The ILO has better factories programs in Bangladesh and Cambodia and other countries. I'm specifically interested in Bangladesh and Cambodia. From your people on the ground, how many of the brands are chipping in to ensure that the laid off garment workers, for instance, in Bangladesh or in Cambodia, are secured a minimum income to survive, given that millions have already been laid off in Bangladesh? And the same with employers, and what are the governments doing in this area as well?
Thanks. I think one of our experts will come to you on that.
Thank you very much for that question. I can take it now, Rosaline, if that's okay.
Yes, that's fine, yes.
Thank you for that. So yes, to the colleagues on the call that are not familiar with the ILO's Better Work program, it's a partnership between the International Finance Corporation and the International Labour Organization, which is active in 9 countries, where in normal circumstances, we monitor working conditions and assist employers with productivity improvements in more than 2,000 factories, employing more than 3 million workers. When this crisis happened, we changed the focus of that program completely. Crisis meeting after crisis meeting with affected governments. And here we include Bangladesh, Vietnam, Myanmar, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, Jordan, and other Better Work countries. Crisis meetings also with the workers and employers. First, to ensure that the health of workers was protected. And secondly, to provide advice to governments, employers, and workers on how to initiate work sharing arrangements, how to ensure that workers were paid or had access to social protection where those systems were operational and exist. And we're still going through the crisis. To give you an example of just how grave it is, in Bangladesh, according to the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers Association, the impact of lost orders alone, the brands, retailers just canceling orders, is more than $3 billion in lost revenue, affecting more than 2.1 million workers out of a total workforce of some 4 million. And please remember, this was an industry, a sector that was already struggling with providing decent work and safe working conditions, just paying overtime in some instances. So this is particularly hard hit. To respond to your question, we are well aware of efforts by our constituents, governments, workers and employers in key garment producing countries to reach out to brands and retailers. And we sometimes facilitate that dialogue to ensure that rather than canceling orders, brands and retailers will postpone, will provide some sort of payments upfront so that factory owners can pay their workers at least a minimum salary in this time of crisis. What we call for in the ILO is solidarity across these supply chains. We call for joint actions by governments, employers, and workers to ensure that this crisis, this industry, will survive what's almost an existential crisis. We have in our brief some specific examples of what governments have done. Remember, these are governments that don't have $1 trillion in their budgets that, like other G20 countries, they can just throw at this problem. But it is significant, for instance, that in Myanmar, the government invested 70 million in supporting enterprises and workers in the sector, or that the Cambodian government provided access to garment workers to social protection measures, and they extended the payment of their contribution to employment insurance funds, because without a salary, the workers wouldn't be able to pay those contributions and therefore wouldn't be covered. I hope that responds to your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Casper. I see, John, is that a follow-up question that you have to what Casper has just said?
Right. Can you give me some concrete examples of good corporate citizenship by some of the major brands? How many have come up and signed the checkbook? It's other than just platitudes.
I can't give you specific numbers. We are seeing some brands, and I would not like to mention names here. I don't have the mandate to do so. Hope you understand. But there are some companies, and they are in the press either themselves talking about it, or they are being reported as ensuring that they stay true to their commitments and that they pay for the orders, even though that there will be a delay in delivering those. There's also quite a few campaigns by major NGOs putting pressure on brands and therefore essentially appealing to consumers that we think twice before we buy new clothes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Casper. And
Rosalind, can I come?
Of course.
This? Yes, I would just say that what we are actually trying to do with these sectoral briefs is to collect from all countries the good examples that enterprises, workers' organizations, but also governments are displaying good practices on to mitigate the impact of the crisis in these several sectors. And we even open our web pages for these good examples. We just want to be this repository of good examples, so that those that actually have those good examples, good practices, can boast about them on our web pages. It's very important that the world knows about these good examples and that we can disseminate this information effectively so that everyone can have access, and these can guide other countries that may want to take, and other industries that may want to take similar measures. I just wanted to add to that point that Casper just raised. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Alette. Before we go to the next couple of questions, I just want to go back to the question that Laurence asked before, which was about violence against violence in the workplace, violence against women, because our expert Oliver Liang, who's head of the private and public sectors unit, wanted also to add some on that issue. Oliver.
Yes, thank you, Rosalind. Yes, on the violence question, I mean, we've already heard that, of course, public violence has gone to, criminality has gone down. We've heard that domestic violence, unfortunately, has gone up. And Christiane has spoken about how that is, for the ILO, also a workplace or a work-related issue. I just wanted to mention there are some sectors, however, that are also experiencing directly increased violence. That would include food retail workers who have to work in stores that are sometimes besieged by panic buyers and have to maintain order, in addition to preserving their own occupational safety and health. We've seen a fair number of reports about that. The public emergency service workers, such as police officers, prison wardens, for example, are faced with a double risk. On one hand, they are extremely exposed to infection, and because some of their own ranks are depleted because of illness, they have to face security situations, including enforcing lockdown measures, for example, which are not always popular. And so they have seen themselves an increased exposure to violence. And then, of course, there are the health workers themselves who are who have to deal with a very difficult situation, sometimes make life or death decisions as to who gets access to certain kinds of equipment or treatments. This puts them under enormous amounts of stress and pressure by patients and family members. And there's unfortunately also something that we've seen in previous pandemics, such as the Ebola crisis, where discrimination and stigma arises, not only vis-a-vis people who are victims of COVID, but the health workers who are perceived as potential carriers of the virus. So it's shameful to say that even near my hometown in the United States, there was a recent incident of someone slashing the tires of 22 health workers because they didn't want them in the community. They were afraid that they were going to somehow spread the virus. So this is a very serious issue that has been raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Okay, the next question is from Freddie Mulongo. Freddie, go ahead.
Bonjour, vous m'entendez? Oui, bonjour.
Oui, bonjour.
Oui, bonjour, c'est Freddy Moulongo, Réveil FM international et accrédité aux Nations Unies. Je voulais simplement poser la question par rapport à l'OIT, à savoir, est-ce qu'avec avec cette pandémie de COVID-19, est-ce qu'il n'y aura pas véritablement de changement par rapport au terme même du travail? Parce qu'on voit avec les confinements que les gens font du télétravail, est-ce que cela ne va pas se répercuter après? Est-ce que le travail sera le même de ce qu'on a connu avant cette pandémie? Est-ce que c'est une question que l'OIT se penche là-dessus? Voilà ma toute petite question.
Thank you, Freddie. Can one of our experts ask that about the future of work and whether there will be any kind of long-standing changes in the way that we work following this pandemic?
Okay, maybe I can just start and then I will pass the floor on to Oliver. I suppose je peux répondre en français peut-être. Oui, ça c'est un très grand concern pour le BIT pour préserver les conditions de travail. C'est pas vraiment évident pendant cette pandémie et c'est ça qui est notre plus grand concern en fait. Ce qui est aussi déjà très clair que les pays en voie de développement, ce sont les plus vulnérables et c'est surtout qu'on voit maintenant qu'il y avait déjà avant la pandémie aussi beaucoup de ce qu'on appelle déficit de travail décent. Et ça, c'est vraiment bien très clair maintenant. Il faut vraiment présavoir qu'on peut maintenir les conditions et améliorer en fait les conditions de travail. Et ça sera surtout basé sur les normes internationales qui donnent beaucoup de direction là-dessus. Et c'est ça sera notre plus grand message. Il ne faut pas du tout utiliser cette pandémie pour diminuer même les conditions de travail. Je vais demander maintenant les collègues, peut-être mes collègues, de donner un petit peu plus d'informations, peut-être plus secteur spécifique sur cette question. Olivier, je crois que toi, tu as quelque chose à dire là-dessus.
C'est bon? Merci. Bon, tout d'abord, merci pour cette question qui est, je crois, très, très intéressant et très important. Tout dépend bien sûr sur l'évolution de cette pandémie dans les prochains mois. Je crois qu'on est tous relativement d'accord que cette pandémie n'est loin d'être finie et puis il y aura peut-être d'autres vagues de maladies qui vont se produire. Donc, les mesures de confinement vont rester importants dans plusieurs pays. Où on a définitivement vu un changement de travail, c'est dans le secteur d'éducation, dans une durée de quelques semaines. Le monde est passé vers l'apprentissage à distance, même en beaucoup de pays en Afrique. C'est très, très impressionnant, comme on a vu les gouvernements déployer des moyens pour faire l'enseignement primaire, secondaire et bien sûr aussi dans les universités et puis TVET, la formation professionnelle, pardon. Et puis, tout cela se passe avec distance. Est-ce que ça va, je crois, provoquer un changement dans l'apprentissage dans l'avenir? Je crois que oui, parce que c'est clair que maintenant, tous ces pays vont commencer à maîtriser ces technologies et avoir même les formations nécessaires pour utiliser ces technologies pour donner des cours, pour faire l'enseignement national. Et puis, on verra comment ça va changer. Ça va avoir un grand impact, par exemple, sur le métier des enseignants. Et l'OIT, avec l'UNESCO et ses autres partenaires, est en train de monitorer cette situation et puis voir quelle est l'implication pour les enseignants de cette évolution. Je crois que par rapport au reste du monde du travail, si on tire les leçons de la dernière pandémie de 1919, la grande pandémie mondiale, la réponse, c'est peut-être non. Une fois qu'elle est finie, les besoins et les désirs économiques vont bien sûr gérer pas mal des questions. Mais à cette époque, on a vu pendant longtemps, c'était en fait la création d'un mécanisme international pour suivre les pandémies. C'était une sorte d'organisation qui était le grand-père de actuel l'OMS, par exemple. Et puis, on espère que ce genre d'investissement dans le secteur public, surtout le secteur public de la santé, va rester dans la mémoire des gens. Parce que une leçon qu'on espère que les gens vont tirer de cette pandémie, c'est qu'il faut être à tout prix, être préparé, être prêt pour des autres vagues, des autres pandémies possibles. Et cela demande une coopération internationale, une surveillance internationale, des grands investissements par rapport aux pays pour avoir le personnel de santé qui est capable de gérer ce genre de crises d'urgence de la santé. Et puis, si je peux juste ajouter, c'est aussi peut-être une bonne stratégie pour la reconstruction, parce qu'il y a quelques années, il y avait une commission sur justement les travailleurs dans la santé et l'économie qui a conclu que les investissements dans le secteur de la santé, c'est aussi un générateur, un catalyseur pour la croissance économique et pour les emplois. Donc, on espère que cette stratégie pourrait aussi être déployée dans la reconstruction qu'on aura maintenant. Merci.
Thank you, Oliver. And then we also have a question, may well be our last one, not sure, from Peter Kenny. Peter, go ahead.
Yes, my next question also concerns a sector of workers who are engaged in the movement of goods and services to the general population, and that is truckers. A lot of them are independent workers, but they've been particularly badly affected in Europe because of lockdowns or closures of borders, and in places like Southern Africa for the same reason, where the movement of goods between countries is very important, and these workers are providing an essential service. And I think it also relates also to North America, between, say, Canada and the United States. Do you have any statistics or narratives on this sector of workers? Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Brant Wagner will be able to answer that question.
Actually, on this sector, you're right. This is a sector that's really affected by the crisis, but also very essential, because if we don't have things moving, we don't have the food we need and the supplies we need to get through the crisis. I don't have, in our briefs that we put forward this time, we don't have a particular brief on this sector. We have been tracking it to some degree to look at the conditions of work in this sector. I don't have that information in front of me right now, so I can't tell you statistically what the impact is. We do know, however, that in the trucking industry, there's a lot of concern because, as we all telework, truckers continue to operate. So we know a lot of the concerns of truckers. For example, you look at the truck stops, the places, the rest stops, to make sure that they're set up in a way to prevent the drivers from having, being infected by the virus. So there's a lot of that kind of concern. There's a lot of concern about, when they take the goods to a particular place and the interaction with others. So that sector has expressed a lot of concern over their ability to continue to operate, but also has been looking for recognition of their essential function. So you can see actually on our site, we do have a recent statement, which is a joint statement. This is what's very interesting about social dialogue. We have a joint statement by the IRU, which is the Global Employers Organization for Trucking, and the International Transport Workers Federation, which is the big global federation of transport workers, where they both come out on these issues, sort of setting out their essential role. They have to keep on moving. They have to keep the trucks moving, but at the same time, and looking for recognition of their need for safety conditions. So it's that balancing act between what's essential to keeping the economy moving and keeping us all with the basic things that we need, at the same time protecting the people in the sector.
Rosalind, can I just add one comment to this particular question?
Mike.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one comment. In a recent meeting last week between the Director General with several employers associations, it was particularly the IRU, the Road Transport Union, the employers in that sector that were complaining a bit that normally countries find it normal that drivers wait 3 hours or sometimes 24 hours before crossing borders, and that now all of a sudden they prove to be essential workers. And they were expressing the hope that this attitude that is now much more favorable towards these truck drivers would continue also after the pandemic. But they also reiterate, as Mr. Wagner has said, that they are the artery of the economy, that every sector depends on them. A very important sector, but again, one of those sectors where workers are not always treated with the decent working conditions and other conditions that we would hope would be awarded to everyone. Thank you.
If I may add one thing also to what Alette said, that, in the ILO, even before the crisis occurred, we're of course focusing on the aid to these sectors to help these sectors operate efficiently. And one of the things that we just actually produced were guidelines on decent work and road transport. This is a product of our department. And this guideline actually contains in it many things that are actually relevant to this particular situation. Even though it's not focused on the virus, nobody knew the name of the virus at that time. But this document actually provides some guidance that we can pull out of our existing toolbox and use to address some of these road transport situations. So just thank you.
Thank you for that, Brant. And you can find those guidelines on the ILO website. If you do have problems finding it, you can always contact me and I will send them to you as well. And that brings us to the end of this virtual press briefing. Thank you all for taking part in this on a very important topic. And as I said, you do have the names of everybody that took part today. So I just want to extend my thanks to all of you. So that's to Alette Van Leur, the Director of the Sectoral Policies Department, and Deputy Director Akira Isawa, Maria Ángeles Fortuny, Head of the Forestry, Agriculture, Construction, Tourism Unit, Brant Wagner, Head of Transport and Maritime Sectors, Casper Edwards, Head of Extractives, Energy and Manufacturing Unit, Oliver Liang, Head of the Private and Public Services Sector Unit, and Christiane Wisco, Senior Health Services Specialist. And they will all be available for interviews by phone later in the week as you kind of mine these briefs, because there's a lot of information in there. and they will be available for further interview. So thank you very much for taking part, and I look forward to being with you for the next virtual press briefing by the ILO. Thank you.